Ikemen. Nice hallway. Oh boy, what a time that has been had. But, as always, glad to be here. And for context, for the trader thing, I can see right there. I've been playing Power World again. Solar's there. And unfortunately, I'm usually busy. Which does mean I had to get ready for stream. But also, I did go ahead and murder a boss. And by that I mean capture a boss. That's all. So that's kind of funny. It'll respawn. It's just the first chilled. You'll understand if you've played. Well, anyways, good evening. I've been having a rough time of it lately. On account of yesterday having a big old migraine. And that sucked. And also, some horrible shenanigans. But we don't need to get into that. Because unfortunately, kinda gross. So instead, we'll do what we usually do, which is, of course, get nice and cozy, snuggle on in, and read some more stories. And of course, just hang out and talk because, let's face it, that's always fun. And we'll go ahead and get back to what I was doing last time, which is reading Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Bulgariad. And we're of course starting with Chapter 2. Eldorn of Wildentor was 18 years old, although his ingenious nature made him seem more boyish. No emotion touched him that did not instantly register on his expression, and sincerity shone on his face like a beacon. He was impulsive, extravagant in his declarations, and probably, Garion reluctantly concluded, not overly bright. It was impossible not to like him, however. The following morning, when Garion pulled on his cloak to go out and continue his watch for Hedar, Eldorn immediately joined him. The young Rend had changed out of his garish clothing and now wore brown hose, a green tunic, and a dark brown wool cape. He carried his bow and wore a quiver of arrows at his belt. As they walked through the snow toward the broken west wall, he amused himself by loosing arrows at targets only half visible ahead of him. I'm such a boy. That is an absolute lie. I'm a victim. I'm especially your victim. Good to see you there, bud. I hope you're doing well. You're awfully good, Garion said admiringly after one particularly fine shot. I'm an historian, Eldorn replied modestly. We've been bowmen for thousands of years. My father had the limbs of this bow cut on the day I was born, and I could draw it by the time I was 8. I imagine you hunt a great deal, Garion said, thinking of the dense forest all around them and the tracks of game he had seen in the snow. It's our most common pastime. Eldorn stopped to pull the arrow he had just shot from the tree trunk. My father prides himself on the fact that beef or mutton are never served at his table. I went hunting once, in Shrek. Here? Eldorn asked. No, wild boars. We didn't use bows, though. The Shreks hunt with spears. Spears? How can you get close enough to kill anything with a spear? Garion laughed a bit ruefully, remembering his bruised ribs and aching head. Getting close isn't the problem. It's getting away after you've speared him that's the difficult part. Eldorn didn't seem to grasp that. The huntsmen form a line, Garen explained, and they crash through the woods, making as much noise as they can. You take your spear and wait where the boars are likely to pass when they try to get away from the noise. Being chased makes them bad-tempered, and when they see you, they charge. That's when you spear them. Isn't that dangerous? Eldorn's eyes were wide. Arian nodded. I almost got all my ribs broken. He was not exactly boasting, but he admitted to himself that he was pleased by Eldorn's reaction to his story. Don't have many dangerous animals in Astoria, Eldorn said almost wistfully. A few bears, and once in a while a pack of wolves. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, looking closely at Garion. Some men, though, find more interesting things to shoot at than wild stags. He said it with a kind of secretive sidelong glance. Oh? Garion was not quite sure what he meant. Hardly a day goes by that some Moonbraid's horse doesn't come home riderless. Garion was shocked at that. Some men think there are too many Moonbraids in Astoria, Eldorn explained with heavy emphasis. I thought the Arentish Civil War was over. There are many who don't believe that. There are many who believe that the war will continue until Astoria is free of the Moonbraid crown. Eldorn's tone left no question as to where he stood in the matter. Isn't the country unified after the Battle of Vomimbre? Garion objected. Unified? How could anybody believe that? Astoria is treated like a subject province. The king's court is at Vomimbre. Every governor, every tax collector, every bailiff, every high sheriff in the kingdom is a Mimbre. There's not a single Astorian in a position of authority anywhere in Erendia. The Mimbraids even refuse to recognize our titles. My father, whose line extends back thousands of years, is called landowner. A Mimbraid would sooner bite out his tongue than call him baron. Eldorn's face had gone white with suppressed indignation. I didn't know that, Garion said carefully, not sure how to handle the young man's feelings. Astoria's humiliation is almost at an end, however, Eldorn declared fervently. There are some men in Astoria for whom patriotism is not dead. And the time is not far off when these men will hunt royal game. He emphasized the statement by snapping an arrow at a distant tree. That confirmed the worst of Garion's fears. Eldorn was a bit too familiar with the details not to be involved in this plot. As if he had realized himself that he had gone too far, Eldorn stared at Garion with consternation. A fool, he blurted with a guilty look around him. I've never learned to control my tongue. Please, forget what I just said, Garion. I know you're my friend, and I know you won't betray what I said in a moment of heat. That was the one thing Garion had feared. With that single statement, Eldorn had effectively sealed his lips. He knew that Mr. Wolf should be warned that some wild scheme was afoot, but Eldorn's declaration of friendship and trust had made it impossible for him to speak. He wanted to grind his teeth with frustration as he stared full in the face of a major moral dilemma. They walked on, neither of them speaking, and both a little embarrassed, until they reached the bit of wall where Garion had waited in ambush the day before. For a time they stared out into the fog, their strained silence growing more uncomfortable by the moment. What's it like in Sandaria? Eldorn asked suddenly. I've never been there. There aren't so many trees, Garion answered, looking over the wall at the dark trunks marching off in the fog. It's an orderly kind of place. Where did you live there? At Falder's farm. It's near Lake Arat. Is this Falder a nobleman? Falder? Garion laughed. No, Valders is calling his old shoes. He's just a farmer. Decent, honest, good-hearted. Miss him. Calmer then, Veldorn said, seeming ready to dismiss Valder as a man of no consequence. Rank doesn't mean very much in Sandaria, Garion told him pointedly. What a man does is more important than what he is. He made a wry face. I was a scullery boy. It's not very pleasant, but somebody's got to do it, I suppose. Not a serf, certainly. Veldorn sounded shocked. There aren't any serfs in Sandaria. No serfs? Serfs, The younger Wren stared at him uncomprehendingly. No, Garion said firmly. We've never found it necessary to have serfs. Veldorn's expression clearly showed that he was baffled by the notion. Garion remembered the voices that had come to him out of the fog the day before, but he resisted the urge to say something about serfdom. Veldorn would never understand, and the two of them were very close to friendship. Garion felt that he needed a friend just now, and he didn't want to spoil things by saying something that would offend this likable young man. What sort of work does your father do? Veldorn asked once politely. He's dead. So's my mother. Garion found that if he said it quickly, it wouldn't hurt so much. Veldorn's eyes filled in sudden, impulsive sympathy. He put his hand consolingly on Garion's shoulder. I'm sorry, he said, his voice almost breaking. It must have been a terrible loss. I was a baby, Garion shrugged, trying to sound offhand about it. I don't even remember them. It was still too personal to talk about. Some pestilence? Veldorn asked gently. No, Garion answered in the same flat tone. They were murdered. Veldorn gasped, and his eyes went wide. Men crept into their village at night and set fire to their house. Garion continued emotionally. My grandmother tried to catch him, but he got away. From what I understand, the man is a very old enemy of my family. Surely you're not going to let it stand like that, Veldorn demanded. No, Garion replied, still looking out into the fog. As soon as I'm old enough, I'm going to find him and kill him. Good lad, Veldorn exclaimed, suddenly catching Garion in a rough embrace. We'll find him and cut him to pieces. We? I'll be going with you, of course, Veldorn declared. No true friend could do any less. He was obviously speaking on impulse, but just as obviously, he was totally sincere. He gripped Garion's hand firmly. I swear to you, Garion, I won't rest until the murderer of your parents lies dead at your feet. The sudden declaration was so totally predictable that Garion silently berated himself for not keeping his mouth shut. His feelings in the matter were very personal, and he was not really sure he wanted company in his search for his faceless enemy. Another part of his mind, however, rejoiced in Veldorn's impulsive but unquestioning support. He decided to let the subject drop. He knew Veldorn well enough by now to realize that the young man undoubtedly made a dozen devout promises a day, quickly offered in absolute sincerity, and just as quickly They talk then of other things, standing close together beside the shattered wall, with their dark cloaks drawn tightly about them. Shortly before noon, Garion heard the muffled sounds of horses' hoofs somewhere in the forest. A few minutes later, Hedar materialized out of the fog, with a dozen wild-looking horses trailing after him. The tall Elgar wore a short, fleece-lined leather cape, His boots were mud-spattered, and his clothes travel-stained, but otherwise, he seemed unaffected by his 2 weeks in the saddle. "Garion," he said gravely by way of greeting, and Garion and Lildoran stepped out to meet him. "Hello, Leilani. Welcome in. Good to see you." Just in the middle of Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad. Yep, we're gonna say the whole thing every time. Everyone will know exactly what we're reading. "I've been waiting for you," Garion told him and introduced Leldoran. "I'll show you to where the others are." Eldar nodded and followed the 2 young men through the ruins to the tower where Mr. Wolf and the others were waiting. "Snow in the mountains," the Algar remarked laconically, by way of explanation, as he swung down from his horse. It delayed me a bit. He pulled his hood back from his shaved head and shook out his long black scalp lock. "No harm has been done," Mr. Wolf replied. "It's nice when you say the title full." "Well, that's a relief." "Come inside to the fire and have something to eat. We've got a lot to talk about." Hadar looked at his horses, his tan, weathered face going strangely blank, as if he were concentrating. The horses all looked back at him, their eyes alert, and their ears pointed sharply forward. Then they turned and picked their way off among the trees. Can I say it 5 times? You mean Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad? Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad? Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad? Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad? Oh, you mean you're just kidding about me saying Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad series? Of course you meant it when you wanted me to say Chapter 2 of Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad. And that's 5. Hey! Alright. Then they turned and picked their way off among the trees. Did they stray? Dernick wanted to know. "No," Hadar answered. "I asked them not to." Dernick looked puzzled, but he let it pass. They all went into the tower and sat near the fireplace. Aunt Pole cut dark bread and pale yellow cheese for them, while Dernick put more wood on the fire. "Shohak sent word to the clan chiefs," Hadar reported, pulling off his cape. He wore a black, long-sleeved horsehide jacket with steel discs riveted to it to form a kind of flexible armor. They gathered at the stronghold for council. The belt of the curved saber he wore, laid it to one side and sat near the fire to eat. Wolf nodded. "Is anyone trying to get through to Pragu?" "Pragu. I sent a troop of my own men to the Goron before I left," Hadar responded. "They'll get through if anyone can." "I hope so," Wolf stated. "The Goron's an old friend of mine. I'll need his help before all this is finished." "Hi, Soleil. Welcome in. Good to see you." Here we are, in the middle of Chapter 2 of The Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad. Hope you're doing well, and I hope school's treating you good too. Goron's an old friend of mine, and I'll need his help before all this is finished. "Aren't you people afraid of the land of the Ulgos?" Leldoran inquired politely. "I've heard that there are monsters there that feed on the flesh of men." Hadar shrugged. "They stay in their lairs in the wintertime. Besides, they're seldom brave enough to attack a full troop of mounted men." He looked over at Mr. Wolf. Southern Sundarius crawled with Murgos. Or did you know that? I could have guessed, Wolf replied. Would they seem to be looking for anything in particular? I don't talk to Murgos, Adar said shortly. His hooked nose and fierce eyes made him look at that moment, like a hawk about to swoop down to the kill. I'm surprised you weren't delayed even more, Silk bantered. The whole world knows how you feel about Murgos. I indulged myself once, Adar admitted. I met two of them alone on the highway. It didn't take very long. Few less to worry about then, Arak grunted with approval. Oh, the BG you tad. No, it's funny, I don't actually have music playing. I have 3 simultaneous videos going on at the same time to capture the essence of the rushing river. Sounds of a rushing river, the gentle sway of a breeze, and a deer scare. River. I think it's time for some plain talk, Mr. Wolf said, brushing crumbs off the front of his tunic. Most of you have some notion of what we're doing, but I don't want anybody blundering into something by accident. We're after a man named Zedar. He used to be one of my master's disciples. Then he went over to Tarak. Early last fall, he somehow slipped into the throne room at Riva and stole the Orb of Alder. We're going to chase him down and get it back. Isn't he a sorcerer too? Arak asked, tugging absently at a thick red braid. That's not the term we use, Wolf replied. But yes, he does have a certain amount of that kind of power. We all did. Me, Beltira, Belkira, Belzadar, all the rest of us. That's one of the things I wanted to warn you about. We all seem to have the same sort of names, Silk noticed. Our master changed our names when he took us as disciples. It was a simple change, but it meant a great deal to us. Wouldn't that mean that your original name was Gareth? Silk asked, his ferret eyes narrowing shrewdly. Mr. Wolf looked startled and then laughed. I haven't heard that name for thousands of years. I've been Belgarath for so long that I'd almost completely forgotten Gareth. It's probably just as well. Gareth was a troublesome boy, a thief and a liar among other things. Some things never change, Antipole observed. Nobody's perfect, Wolf admitted blandly. Why did Zedar steal the orb? Adar asked, setting aside his plate. He always wanted it for himself, the old man replied. That could be it, but more likely, he's trying to take it to Tarak. The one who delivers the orb to One Eye is going to be his favorite. But Tarak is dead. But Tarak is dead, Laldorn objected. The Riven Warder killed him at Vomimbre. No, Wolf said. Tarak isn't dead, only asleep. Grand Sword wasn't the one destined to kill him. Zedar carried him off after the battle and hid him someplace. Someday, he'll awaken. Probably someday, fairly soon, if I'm reading the signs right. We've got to get the orb back before that happens. This Zedar's caused a lot of trouble, Arak grumbled. You should have dealt with him a long time ago. Possibly, Wolf admitted. Why don't you just wave your hand and make him disappear? Rex suggested, making a sort of gesture with his thick fingers. Wolf shook his head. I can't. Not even the gods can do that. You got some big problems then, Silk said with a frown. Every Murgo from here to Rakgoska is trying to stop us from catching Zedar. Not necessarily, Wolf disagreed. Zedar's got the orb, but Tuchik commands the Groms. Tuchik? Eldorn asked. The Grolem High Priest. He and Zedar hate each other. I think we can count on him to try to keep Zedar from getting to Tarek with the orb. Tarek shrugged. What difference does it make? You and Polgara can use magic if we run into anything difficult, can't you? There are limitations on that sort of thing, Wolf said a bit evasively. I don't understand, Rex said, frowning. Mr. Wolf took a deep breath. All right, as long as it's come up, let's go into that too. Sorcery, if that's what you want to call it, is a disruption of the natural order of things. Sometimes it has certain unexpected effects, so you have to be very careful about what you do with it. Not only that, it makes... He frowned. Let's call it a sort of noise. That's not exactly what it is, but it serves well enough to explain. Others with the same abilities can hear that noise. Once Polgara and I start changing things, every Grolem in the West is going to know exactly where we are and what we're doing. They'll keep piling things in front of us until we're exhausted. It takes almost as much energy to do things that way as it does to do them with your arms and back, Antipole explained. It's very tiring. She sat beside the fire, carefully mending a small tear in one of Garion's tunics. I didn't know that, Rag admitted. Not many people do. If we have to, Pole, Pole and I can take certain steps, Wolf went on. But we can't keep it up forever, and we can't simply make things vanish. I'm sure you can see why. Oh, of course, Silk professed, though his tone indicated that he did not. Everything that exists depends on everything else, Antipole explained quietly. If you were to unmake one thing, it's altogether possible that everything would vanish. The fire popped, and Garion jumped slightly. The vaulted chamber seemed suddenly dark, and shadows lurked in the corners. That can't happen, of course, Wolf told them. When you try to unmake something, your will simply recoils on you. If you say, be not, then you are the one who vanishes. That's why we're very careful about what we say. I can understand why, Silk said, his eyes widening slightly. Most of the things we encounter can be dealt with by ordinary means, Wolf continued, and that's the reason we brought you together. At least, that's one of the reasons. Among you, you'll be able to handle most of the things that get in our way. The important thing to remember is that Polgara and I have to get to Zedar before he can reach Tarek with the orb. Zedar's found some way to touch the orb. I don't know how. If he can show Tarek how it's done, no power on Earth will be able to stop One Eye from becoming king and god over the whole world. They all sat in the ruddy, flickering light of the fire, their faces serious as they considered that possibility. I think that pretty well covers everything, don't you, Pole? I believe so, Father, she replied, smoothing the front of her gray homespun gown. Later, outside the tower, as gray evening crept in among the foggy ruins of Volakun and the smell of thick stew Antpole was cooking for supper drifted out to them. Arian turned to Silk. Is it all really true? He asked. The small man looked out into the fog. Let's act as if we believed that it is, he suggested. Under the circumstances, I think it'd be a bad idea to make a mistake. Are you afraid too, Silk? Arian asked. Hi, Jam Jam. Good to see you. Welcome into the middle of Chapter 2 of the Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariad series. I hope you're doing well. Thank you, Jam Jam. Oh no, none of that now. Thank you. Oh my gosh, the emotes. Are you afraid too, Silk? Arian asked. Silk sighed. Yes, he admitted. But we can behave as if we believe that we aren't, can't we? I guess we can try, Arian said, and the two of them turned to go back into the chamber at the foot of the tower where the firelight danced on the low stone arches, holding the fog and chill at bay. And that there is the end of Chapter 2. For those of you that joined us a bit late, Hedar's back. Very good introduction to Lel Dorian. And you've heard the plot, what we're doing here for now. Hooray! Chapter 2 was short? Yeah, I think so. Took about half an hour-ish. That just means we'll have fun with Chapter 3. The next morning, Silk came out of the tower wearing a rich maroon doublet and a bag-like black velvet cap cocked jauntily over one ear. What's all that about? Antpole asked him. I chanced to cross an old friend in one of the packs, Silk replied airily, Redick of Boktor by name. What happened to Ambar of Kotu? Ambar's a good enough fellow, I suppose, Silk said a bit deprecatingly, but a Murgo named Asherak knows about him and may have dropped his name in certain quarters. Let's not look for trouble if we don't have to. Not a bad disguise, Mr. Wolf agreed. One more Drazian merchant on the Great West Road won't attract any attention. Whatever his name. Please, Silk objected in an injured tone. The name's very important. You hang the whole disguise on the name. I don't see any difference, Barak asserted bluntly. You mean, Leilani, Chapter 3 of the Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 of the Belgariads? I'm so sorry to anyone that's going to watch this later, but for those of you joining in, I'm glad to share it with you. I just hope you're all doing well and relaxing. I don't see any difference, Barak asserted bluntly. There's all the difference in the world. Surely you can see that Ambar's a vagabond with very little regard for ethics, while Redick's a man of substance, whose word is good in all the commercial centers of the West. Besides, Redick's always accompanied by servants. Servants? Vanderpool's eyebrows shot up. Just for the sake of the disguise, Silk assured her quickly. You, of course, could never be a servant, Lady Bulgara. Thank you. No one would ever believe it. You'll be my sister instead, traveling with me to see the splendors of Tol Honet. Your sister. You could be my mother instead, if you prefer, Silk suggested blandly, making a religious pilgrimage to Mar Tarim to atone for a colorful past. What are we reading, Jam Jam? We are reading Chapter 3 of Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 in the Belgariad series. I'm so sorry. Aunt Pole gazed steadily at the small man for a moment, while he grinned impudently at her. Someday, your sense of humor is going to get you in a great deal of trouble, Prince Keldar. I'm always in trouble, Lady Bolgar. I wouldn't know how to act if I weren't. I'll see your dance of the day? Of course I do, Jam Jam. Where do you suppose we could get started? Mr. Wolf asked. Oh, it's a Lethal Company dance. Cute. Just a moment more, Silk replied. If we meet anyone and have to explain things, you, Leldor, and Ulgarian are Polgar servants. Hetar, Barak, and Durnik are mine. Anything you say, Wolf agreed wearily. There are reasons. All right. Don't you want to hear them? Not particularly. Silk looked a bit hurt. Are we ready? Wolf asked. Everything's out of the tower, Durnik told him. Oh, just a moment. I forgot to put out the fire. He went back inside. Wolf glanced after the smith in exasperation. What difference does it make? He muttered. This place is a ruin anyway. Leave him alone, father, Aunt Pole said placidly. It's the way he is. As they prepared to mount, Barak's horse, a large, sturdy gray, sighed and threw a reproachful look at Hedar, and the Algar chuckled. What's so funny? Barak demanded suspiciously. The horse said something, Hedar replied. Never mind. Then they swung into their saddles and threaded their way out of the foggy ruins and along the narrow, muddy track that wound into the forest. Sodden snow lay under wet trees, and water dripped continually from the branches overhead. They all drew their cloaks about them to ward off the chill and dampness. Once they were under the trees, Leldorn pulled his horse beside Garian's, and they rode together. Is Prince Keldar always so, well, extremely complicated? He asked. Silk? Oh, yes, he's very devious. You see, he's a spy, and disguises and clever lies are second nature to him. A spy? Really? Eldorn's eyes brightened as his imagination caught hold of the idea. He works for his uncle, the King of Drasnia, Garian explained. From what I understand, the Drasnians have been at this sort of thing for centuries. Got to stop and pick up the rest of the packs, Silk was reminding Mr. Wolf. I haven't forgotten, the old man replied. Packs? Leldorn asked. Silk picked up some wool cloth in Kamar, Garian told him. He said it would give us a legitimate reason to be on the highway. We hid them in a cave when we left the road to come to Volakun. He thinks of everything, doesn't he? He tries. We're lucky to have him with us. Maybe we could have him show us a few things about disguises, Eldorn suggested brightly. It might be very useful when we go looking for your enemy. Garian had thought that Leldorn had forgotten his impulsive pledge. The young Aren's mind seemed too flighty to keep hold of one idea for very long. But he saw now how Leldorn only seemed to forget things. The prospect of a serious search for his parents' murderer, with this young enthusiast, added embellishments and improvisations at every turn, began to present itself alarmingly. By mid-morning, after they had picked up Silk's packs and lashed them to the back of the spare horses, they were back out on the Great West Road, the Medron Highway running through the heart of the forest. They rode south at a loping canter that ate up the miles. They passed a heavily burdened serf, clothed in scraps and pieces of sackcloth tied on with bits of string. The serf's face was gaunt, and he was very thin under his rags. He stepped off the road and stared at them with apprehension until they had passed. Arian felt a sudden stab of compassion. He briefly remembered Lammer and Detton. He wondered what would finally happen to them. It seemed important for some reason. Is it really necessary to keep them so poor? He demanded of Leldoran, unable to hold it in any longer. Who? Leldoran asked, looking around. That serf. Leldoran glanced back over his shoulder at the ragged man. You didn't even see him, Arian accused. Leldoran shrugged. There are so many. And they all dress in rags and live on the edge of starvation. And pay taxes, Leldoran replied, as if that explained everything. You seem to have always had enough to eat. I'm not a serf, Garion, Leldoran answered patiently. The poorest people always suffer the most. It's the way the world is. It doesn't have to be, Garion retorted. You just don't understand. No, and I never will. Naturally not, Leldoran said with infuriating complacency. You're not a Rendish. Arian clenched his teeth to hold back the obvious reply. By late afternoon, they had covered 10 leagues, and the snow had largely disappeared from the roadside. Shouldn't we start to give some thought to where we're going to spend the night, Father? Antipole suggested. Mr. Wolf scratched thoughtfully at his beard as he squinted at the shadows hovering in the trees around them. I have an uncle who lives not far from here, Leldoran offered. Count Reldigan. I'm sure he'll be glad to give us shelter. Thin? Mr. Wolf asked. Dark hair? It's gray now, Leldoran replied. You know him. I haven't seen him for 20 years, Wolf told him. As I recall, he used to be quite a hothead. Uncle Reldigan. You must have confused him with somebody else, Belgarath. Maybe, Wolf said. How far is it to his house? No more than 1.5 leagues away. Let's go see him, Wolf decided. Leldoran shook his reins and moved into the lead to show them the way. How are you and your friend getting along? Silk asked, falling in beside Garion. Fine, I suppose, Garion replied, not quite sure how the rat-faced little man intended the question. It seems to be a little hard to explain things to him, though. That's only natural, Silk observed. He's an Arend, after all. Garion quickly came to Leldoran's defense. He's honest and very brave. They all are. That's part of the problem. I like him, Garion asserted. So do I, Garion, but that doesn't keep me from realizing the truth about him. You're trying to say something. Why don't you just go ahead and say it? All right, I will. Don't let friendship get to the better of your good sense. Arendia's a very dangerous place, and Arends tend to blunder into disasters quite regularly. Don't let your exuberant young companion drag you into something that's none of your business. Silk's look was direct, and Garion realized that the little man was quite serious. Be careful, he promised. I knew I could count on you. Silk said gravely. Are you making fun of me? Would I do that, Carrion? Silk asked mockingly. Then he laughed, and they rode on together through the gloomy afternoon. The gray stone. Hello there, Nuo. Welcome in. Hopefully you're having a wonderful day or evening. And hope you'll continue to have a nice, cozy experience. Welcome in. The gray stone house of Count Raldigan was about a mile back, the horse in the forest from the highway, and it stood in the center of a clearing that extended beyond bowshot in every direction. My voice is too soft? That happens. It feels weird. That's fair. This is supposed to be soft, gentle reading, so I suppose it's in the nature of things. Is it magic? Some might say so. Me, though, it is simply natural. Although it had no wall, it had somehow the look of a fort. The windows, facing out, were narrow and covered with iron gratings. Strong turrets surmounted by battlements stood at each corner, and the gate which opened into the central courtyard of the house was made of whole tree trunks, squared off and strapped together with iron bands. If it was magic, you'll find it. Will the power of anime be there too, Nuo? Arian stared at the brooding pile as they approached in the rapidly fading light. There was a kind of haughty ugliness about the house, a grim solidity that seemed to defy the world. It's not a very pleasant-looking sort of place, is it? He said to Silk. Lost it? Dang. Story and architecture is a reflection of their society, Silk replied. A strong house isn't a bad idea in a country where neighborhood disputes sometimes get out of hand. Are they all so afraid of each other? Just cautious, Garion. Just cautious. Eldorn dismounted before the heavy gate and spoke to someone on the other side who was small-grilled. There was finally a rattling of chains and the grinding sound of heavy, iron-shod bars sliding back. I wouldn't make any quick moves once we're inside, Silk advised quietly. There will probably be archers watching us. Yours is just too powerful. Yeah, the ASMR voice certainly is powerful, I suppose. And what am I saying? Turns out that I am reading a book. Specifically, Chapter 3 of Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 in the Belgariad series. Yep. Chapter 3. Had to check. Bad one? Well, everyone's entitled to their opinion. And you're, of course, free to go somewhere else if you don't enjoy it. And if you do leave, well wishes, hope you find someone that better suits your taste. Should read a better book? I could. Or I could read something that's fun and enjoyable, like JoJo. I mean, it would be fun to read a manga someday. I'll consider it. And then we can turn on the normal voice and get all voice acty. That would be silly. For now, nice, soft, gentle reading. And put people to sleep after all. I wouldn't make any quick moves once we're inside, Silk advised quietly. There will probably be archers watching us. Arian looked at him sharply. A quaint custom of the region, Silk informed him. He rode into a cobblestoned courtyard and dismounted. Count Reldigan, when he appeared, was a tall, thin man with iron-gray hair and beard who walked with the aid of a stout cane. Sleep well, Newell. He wore a rich green doublet and black hose, despite the fact that he was in his own house and carried a sword at his side. He limped heavily down a broad flight of stairs from the house to greet them. Uncle, Eldorn said, bowing respectfully. Nephew, the Count replied, in polite acknowledgement. My friends and I found ourselves in the vicinity, Eldorn stated, and we thought we might impose on you for the night. You're always welcome, nephew, Reldigan answered with a kind of grave formality. Have you dined yet? No, uncle. Then you must all take supper with me. May I know your friends? Mr. Wolf pushed back his hood and stepped forward. You and I are already acquainted, Reldigan, he said. Count's eyes widened. Elgorath, is it really you? Wolf grinned. Oh, yes. I'm still wandering about the world, stirring up mischief. Reldigan laughed then and grasped Wolf's upper arm warmly. Come inside, all of you. Let's not stand about in the cold. He turned and limped up the steps to the house. What happened to your leg? Wolf asked him. An arrow in the knee, the Count shrugged. The result of an old disagreement, long since forgotten. As I recall, you used to get quite involved in quite a few of those. I thought for a while that you intended to go through life with your sword half drawn. I was an excitable youth, the Count admitted, opening the broad door at the top of the steps. He led them down a long hallway to a room of imposing size and a large blazing fireplace at each end. Great curving stone arches supported the ceiling. The floor was of polished black stone, scattered with fir rugs, and the walls, arches, and ceiling were whitewashed in gleaming contrast. Heavy carved chairs of dark brown wood sat here and there, and a great table with an iron candelabra in its center stood near the fireplace at one end. A dozen or so leather-bound books were scattered on its polished surface. Books, Reldigan? Mr. Wolf said in amazement as he and the others removed their cloaks and gave them to the servants who immediately appeared. You have mellowed, my friend. The Count smiled at the old man's remark. I'm forgetting my manners, Wolf apologized. My daughter, Polgara. Oh, this is Count Reldigan, an old friend. My lady, the Count acknowledged with an exquisite bow. My house is honored. Aunt Pol was about to reply when two young men burst into the room, arguing heatedly. You're an idiot, Barentain. The first, a dark-haired youth in a scarlet doublet, snapped. It may please thee to think so, Torasin. The second, a stout young man with pale curly hair and wearing a green and yellow striped tunic, replied. But whether it please thee or not, Asturia's future is in mid-grade hands. Thy rancorous pronouncements and sulphurous rhetoric shall not alter that fact. Not thee, me, or thou me, Barentain, the dark-haired one sneered. Your imitation mid-grade courtesy turns my stomach. Gentlemen, that's enough, Count Reldigan said sharply, rapping his cane on the stone floor. If you two are going to insist on discussing politics, I'll have you separated, forcibly if necessary. Two young men scowled at each other and then stalked off to opposite sides of the room. My son, Torreson, the Count admitted apologetically, indicating the dark-haired youth, and his cousin Barentane, the son of my late wife's brother. They've been wrangling like this for 2 weeks now. I had to take their swords away from them the day after Barentane arrived. Political discussion is good for the blood, my lord, Silk observed, especially in the winter. The heat keeps the veins from clogging up. The Count chuckled at the little man's remark. Prince Keldar of the royal house of Drasnia, Mr. Wolf introduced Silk. Your Highness? The Count responded, bowing. Silk winced slightly. Please, my lord, I've spent a lifetime running from that mode of address, and I'm sure that my connection with the royal family embarrasses my uncle almost as much as it embarrasses me. The Count laughed again with easy good nature. Why don't we all adjourn to the dining table, he suggested. 2 fat deer have been turning on spits in my kitchen since daybreak, and I recently obtained a cask of red wine from southern Tolnandra. As I recall, Belgrave has always had a great fondness for good food and fine wines. He hasn't changed, my lord, Aunt Pole told him. My father is terribly predictable once you get to know him. Count smiled and offered her his arm as they all moved toward the door on the far side of the room. Tell me, my lord, Aunt Pole said, do you by chance have a bathtub in your house? Bathing in winter is dangerous, Lady Polgara, the Count warned her. My lord, she said gravely, I've been bathing winter or summertime for more years than you could possibly imagine. Let her bathe, Reldigan, Mr. Wolf urged. Her temper deteriorates quite noticeably when she thinks she's getting dirty. A bath wouldn't hurt you either, old wolf, Aunt Pole retorted tartly. You're starting to get a bit strong from the downwind side. Mr. Wolf looked a bit injured. Much later, after they had eaten their fill of venison, gravy-soaked bread, and rich cherry tarts, Aunt Pole excused herself and went with a maidservant to oversee the preparation of her bath. The men all lingered at the table over their wine cups, their faces washed with the golden light of the many candles in Reldigan's dining hall. Let me show you to your rooms, Torreson suggested to Leldor and Garion, pushing back his chair and casting a look of veiled contempt across the table at Barentane. He followed him from the room and up a long flight of stairs towards the upper stories of the house. I don't want to offend you, Tor, Eldoran said as they climbed, but your cousin has some peculiar ideas. Torreson snorted. Barentane's a jackass. He thinks he can impress the Membrates by imitating their speech and by fawning on them. His dark face was angry in the light of the candle he carried to light their way. Why should he want to? Leldorn asked. He's desperate for some kind of holding he can call his own, Torreson replied. My mother's brother has had very little land to leave him. Fat idiots all calf-eyed over the daughter of one of the barons in his district, and since the baron won't even consider a landless suitor, Barentane's trying to wheedle an estate from a Membrate governor. He'd swear fealty to the ghost of Caltorek himself if he thought it would get him land. Doesn't he realize that he hasn't got a chance? Leldorn inquired. There are too many land-hungry Membrate knights around the governor for him to even think of granting an estate to an Asturian. I've told him the same thing myself, Torreson declared with scathing contempt. But there is no reasoning with him. His behavior degrades our whole family. Eldorn shook his head commiseratingly as they reached an upper hall. He looked around quickly then. We have to talk with you, Tor, he blurted. his voice dropping to a whisper. Thorson looked at him sharply. My father's committed me to Belgoroth's service in a matter of great importance. Eldoran hurried on in that same hushed voice. Don't know how long we'll be gone, so you and the others will have to kill Corydulin without me. Thorson's eyes went wide with horror. We're not alone, Eldoran, he said in a strangled voice. I'll go down to the other end of the hall, Varian said quickly. No, Eldoran replied firmly, taking hold of Garion's arm. Garion's my friend, Tor. I have no secrets from him. Eldoran, please, Varian protested. I'm not an historian. I'm not even an Arend. I don't want to know what you're planning. But you will know, Garion, as proof of my trust in you, Eldoran declared. Next summer, when Corydulin journeys into the ruined city of Voaster to hold court there, for the 6 weeks that maintain the fiction of Arendish unity, we're going to ambush him on the highway. Eldoran, Thorson gasped, his face turning white. Eldoran was already plunging on. It won't be just a simple ambush, Garion. There will be a masterstroke at Membray's heart. We are going to ambush him in the uniforms of Tolnedran legionnaires and cut him down with Tolnedran swords. Our attack will force Membray to declare war on the Tolnedran Empire, and Tolnedra will crush Membray like an eggshell. Membray will be destroyed, and Astoria will be free. Jack will have you killed for this, Eldoran, Thorson cried. We've all been sworn to secrecy on a blood oath. Tell them, Murgo, I spit on his oath, Eldoran said hotly. What need have Asturian patriots for a Murgo henchman? He's providing us with gold, you blockhead, Thorson raged, almost beside himself. We need his good red gold to buy the uniforms, the swords, and to strengthen the backbones of some of our weaker friends. I don't need weaklings with me, Eldoran said intensely. A patriot does what he does for love of his country, not for Angaric gold. Arion's mind was moving quickly now. His moment of stunned amazement had passed. There was a man in Chirek, he recalled, the Earl of Jarvik. He also took Murgo gold and plotted to kill a king. The two stared at him blankly. Something happens to a country when you kill its king, Varian explained. No matter how bad the king is or how good the people are who kill him, the country falls apart for a while. Everything is confused and there's nobody to point the country in any one direction. Then, if you start a war between that country and another one at the same time, you add just that much more to the confusion. I think that if I were Murgo, that's exactly the kind of confusion I'd want to see in all the kingdoms of the West. Varian listened to his own voice, almost in amazement. There was a dry, dispassionate quality in it that he instantly recognized. From the time of his earliest memories, that voice had always been there, inside his mind, occupying some quiet, hidden corner, telling him when he was wrong or foolish. But the voice had never actively interfered before in his dealings with other people. Now, however, it spoke directly to these two young men, patiently explaining. So one moment. Angaric gold isn't what it seems to be, he went on. There's a kind of power in it that corrupts you. Maybe that's why it's the color of blood. I'd think about that before I accepted any more red gold from this Murgo Machak. Why do you suppose he's giving you gold and helping you with this plan of yours? He's not an Asturian, So patriotism couldn't have anything to do with that, could it? I'd think about that too. Silly Zara, thank you for following, and welcome. I hope you're having a wonderful evening. Sniffle. Lildorn and his cousin looked suddenly troubled. I'm not going to say anything about this to anybody, Arian said. You told me about it in confidence, and I really wasn't supposed to hear about it anyway. Remember that there's a lot more going on in the world right now than what's happening here in Orendia. Now, I think I'd like to get some sleep. You'll show me to where my bed is. I'll leave you to talk things over all night, if you'd like. All in all, Arian thought he'd handled the whole thing rather well. He'd planted a few doubts at the very least. He knew Lorenz well enough by now to realize that it probably wouldn't be enough to turn these two around, but it was a start. And with that is the end of Chapter 3. Making good progress today. Honestly, we could keep going for a while longer. I think, though, I'm going to take a small little break and be back in a few minutes. You all should do the same. Alright, everyone. I will see you all in a bit. Kaboo. I am back. I noticed while reading my throat was starting to gunk up a little bit. And I will call that Revenge of the Cookies and Cream Milkshake. I really should know better than to have anything like that before starting a stream, but I wanted some sweetness today. And unfortunately, I didn't get ice cream. Ham, but not stealthily anyways. Anyways, we'll go ahead and get back into reading Chapter 4 of Queen of Sorcery, Book 2 in the Belgariad series. And the cookies and cream milkshake, it was good, nice and tasty. And I always enjoy the cherry at the very end. Got that nice sweet tartness, a perfect send-off. And now, Chapter 4. Here we go. The following morning, they rode out early while the mist still hung among the trees. Count Reldigan, wrapped in a dark cloak, stood at his gate to bid them farewell, and Torsen, standing beside his father, seemed unable to take his eyes off Garion's face. That's right, you don't like cherries. That's fair. Garion kept his expression as blank as possible. The fiery young historian seemed to be filled with doubts, and those doubts might keep him from plunging headlong into something disastrous. It wasn't much, Garion realized, but it was the best he could manage under the circumstances. "Come back soon, Belgarath," Reldigan said. "Sometime you can stay longer. We're very isolated here, and I'd like to know what the rest of the world's doing. Sit by the fire and talk away a month or two." Mr. Wolf nodded gravely. "Maybe when this business of mine is over, Reldigan." Then he turned his horse and led the way across the wide clearing that surrounded Reldigan's house, and back once again into the gloomy forest. "Count's an unusual errand," Silk said lightly as they rode along. "I think I actually detected an original thought or two in him last evening." "He's changed a great deal," Wolf agreed. "He sets a good table," Varek said. "I haven't felt this full since I left Valalorn." "You should," Antipole told him. "You ate the biggest part of one deer by yourself." "You're exaggerating, Polgaro," Varek said. "But not by very much," Etar observed in his quiet voice. Veldoran had pulled his horse in beside Garion's, but he had not spoken. His face was as troubled as his cousin's had been. It was obvious that he wanted to say something, and just as obvious that he didn't know how to begin. "Go ahead," Garion said quietly. "We're good enough friends that I'm not going to be upset if it doesn't come out exactly right." "Zoe Core, thank you for following, and welcome in. I also hope that you're having a wonderful evening." So, hope you enjoy your stay as you get nice and cozy and enjoy the reading. Eldoran looked a little sheepish. "Am I really that obvious?" "Honest is a better word for it," Garion told him. "You've just never learned to hide your feelings, that's all." "Is it really true?" Veldoran blurted. "I'm not doubting your word, but is there really a Murgo in Shrek plotting against King Anhag?" "Ask Silk," Garion suggested. "Or Barek. Or Hedar. Any of them. We were all there." "Jack isn't like that, though," Veldoran said quickly, defensively. "Can you be sure?" Garion asked him. "The plan was his in the first place, wasn't it? Where'd you happen to meet him?" "We'd all gone down to the Great Fair. Torsen, me, several of the others. We bought some things from a Murdo merchant, and Tor made a few remarks about membranes. You know how Tor is. The merchant said that he knew somebody we might be interested in meeting, and he introduced us to Nachak. The more we talked with him, the more sympathetic he seemed to become to the way we felt." "Naturally." told us what the king is planning, you wouldn't believe it. Probably not. Eldorn gave him a quick, troubled look. He's going to break up our estates and give them to landless membrane nobles. He said it accusingly. Did you verify that with anybody but Nachak? Could we? The membrates wouldn't admit it if we confronted them with it, but it's the kind of thing membrates would do. So, we've only got Nachak's word for it. How did this plan of yours come up? Nachak said that if he were an Asturian, he wouldn't let anybody take his land. But he said that it'd be too late to try to stop them when they came with the knights and soldiers. He said that if he were doing it, he'd strike before they were ready, and that he'd do it in such a way that the membrates wouldn't know who'd done it. That's when he suggested the Tonedran uniforms. When did he start giving you money? I'm not sure. Tor handled that part of it. Did he ever say why he was giving you money? He said it was out of friendship. Didn't that seem a little odd? I'd give someone money out of friendship, Leldor protested. You're an Asturian, Garion told him. You'd give somebody your life out of friendship. Nachak's a Murgo, though, and I've never heard that they were all that generous. What it comes down to, then, is that a stranger tells you that the king is planning to take your land. Then he gives you a plan to kill the king and start a war with Tonedra, and to make sure you succeed with his plan, he gives you money. Is that about it? Eldor nodded mutely, his eyes stricken. Weren't any of you just the least bit suspicious? Eldor seemed almost about to cry. Such a good plan, he burst out finally. It couldn't help but succeed. That's what makes it so dangerous, Marion replied. Marion, what am I going to do? Eldorn's voice was anguished. I don't think there's anything you can do right now, Marion told him. Maybe later, after we've had some time to think about it, we'll come up with something. If we can't, we can always tell my grandfather about it. He'll think of a way to stop it. Can't tell anybody, Leldorn reminded him. We're pledged to silence. We might have to break that pledge, Arian said somewhat reluctantly. I don't see that either of us owes that Murgo anything, but it's going to have to be up to you. I won't say anything to anybody without your permission. You decide, Leldor pleaded then. I can't do it, Garion. You're going to have to, Garion told him. I'm sure that if you think about it, you'll see why. They reached the Great West Road then, and Barek led them south at a brisk trot, cutting off the possibility of further discussion. A league or so down the road, they passed a muddy village, a dozen or so turf-roofed huts with walls made of wattles plastered over with mud. The fields around the village were dotted with tree stumps, and a few scrawny cows grazed near the edge of the forest. Arian could not control his indignation as he looked at the misery implicit in the crude collection of hovels. Eldoran, he said sharply, look. Hello, Yusena. Welcome in. And good evening. What? Where? The blond young man came out of his troubled preoccupation quickly, as if expecting some danger. Village, Arian told him. Look at it. It's only a serf's village, Eldorn said indifferently. I've seen hundreds like it. He seemed ready to return to his own inner turmoil. In Sandaria, we wouldn't keep pigs in a place like that. Arian's voice rang with fervor. If he could only make his friend see. Two ragged serfs were dispiritedly hacking chunks of firewood from one of the stumps near the road. As the party approached, they dropped their axes and bolted in terror for the forest. Does it make you proud, Leldorin? Arian demanded. Does it make you feel good to know that your own countrymen are so afraid of you that they run from the very sight of you? Leldorin looked baffled. They're serfs, Garion, as if that explained it. They're men. They're not animals. Men deserve to be treated better. I can't do anything about it. They aren't my serfs. And with that, Leldorin's attention turned inward again, as he continued to struggle with the dilemma Garion had placed upon him. By late afternoon, they had covered 10 leagues, and the cloudy sky was gradually darkening as evening approached. I think we're going to have to spend the night in the forest, Belgarath, Silk said, looking around. There's no chance of reaching the next Tolmedron hostel. Mr. Wolf had been half dozing in his saddle. I looked up, blinking a bit. All right, he replied. Let's get back from the road a bit. Our fire could attract attention, and too many people know we're in Arendi already. There's a woodcutter's track right there. Vernick pointed at a break in the trees just ahead. It should lead us back into the trees. All right, both agreed. The sound of their horses' hooves was muffled by the sodden leaves on the forest floor as they turned in among the trees to follow the narrow track. They rode silently for the better part of a mile until a clearing opened ahead of them. How about here? Vernick asked. He indicated a brook trickling softly over mossy stones on one side of the clearing. It will do, both agreed. We're going to need shelter, the smith observed. We bought tents in Kamar, Silk told him. They're in the packs. That was foresighted of you, Anspo complimented him. I've been in Arendia before, my lady. I'm familiar with the weather. Garion and I'll go get wood for a fire then, Vernick said, climbing down from his horse and untying his axe from his saddle. I'll help you, Eldorn offered, his face still troubled. Vernick nodded and led the way off into the trees. The woods were soaked, but the smith seemed to know almost instinctively where to find dry fuel. They worked quickly in the lowering twilight and soon had 3 large bundles of limbs and branches. They returned to the clearing where Silk and the others were erecting several dun-colored tents. Vernick dropped his wood and cleared a space for the fire with his foot. Then he knelt and began striking sparks with his knife from a piece of flint into a wad of dry tinder he always carried. In a short time, he had a small fire going, and Aunt Pole set out her pots beside it, humming softly to herself. Dar came back from tending the horses, and they all stood back, watching Aunt Pole prepare supper from the stores Count Reldigan had pressed on them before they had left his house that morning. After they had eaten, they sat around the fire talking quietly. How far have we come today? Vernick asked. 12 leagues, Hadar estimated. How much farther do we have to go to get out of the forest? It's 80 leagues from Kamar to the central plain, Eldorn replied. Vernick sighed. A week or more. I'd hoped that it'd only be a few days. I know what you mean, Dernick, Barak agreed. It's gloomy under all these trees. The horses, picketed near the brook, stirred uneasily. Hedar rose to his feet. Something wrong? Barak asked, also rising. He shouldn't be. Hedar started. Then he stopped. Back, he snapped, away from the fire. The horses say there are men out there. Many, with weapons. He jumped back from the fire, drawing his saber. Eldorn took one startled look at him and bolted for one of the tents. Arian's sudden disappointment in his friend was almost like a blow to the stomach. An arrow buzzed into the light and shattered on Barak's mail shirt. Arm yourselves, the big man roared, drawing his sword. Arian grasped Ampol's sleeve and tried to pull her from the light. Stop that, she snapped, jerking her sleeve free. Another arrow whizzed out of the foggy woods. Ampol flicked her hand as if brushing away a fly and muttered a single word. The arrow bounced back as if it had struck something solid and fell to the ground. Then, with a hoarse shout, a gang of rough, burly men burst from the edge of the trees and splashed across the brook, brandishing swords. As Barak and Hedar leaped forward to meet them, Eldorn reemerged from the tent with his bow and began loosing arrows so rapidly that his hands seemed to blur as they moved. Arian was instantly ashamed that he had doubted his friend's courage. With a choked cry, one of the attackers stumbled back, an arrow through his throat. Another doubled over sharply, clutching at his stomach, and fell to the ground groaning. A third, quite young and with a pale, downy beard on his cheeks, dropped heavily and sat plucking at the feathers on his shaft, protruding from his chest with a bewildered expression on his boyish face. Then he sighed and slumped over on his side with a stream of blood coming from his nose. The ragged-looking men faltered under the rain of Leldorn's arrows, and then Barak and Hedar were upon them. With a great sweep, Barak's heavy sword shattered an upflung blade and crunched down into the angle between the neck and shoulder of a black-whiskered man who had held it. The man collapsed. Hedar made a quick feint with his saber, then ran it smoothly through the body of a pock-marked ruffian. The man stiffened, and a gush of bright blood burst from his mouth as Hedar pulled out his blade. Vernig ran forward with his axe, and Silk drew his long dagger from under his vest and ran directly at a man with a shaggy brown beard. At the last moment, he dived forward, rolled, and struck the bearded man full in the chest with both feet. Without pausing, he came up and ripped his dagger into his enemy's belly. The dagger made a wet, tearing sound as it sliced upward, and the stricken man clutched at his stomach with a scream, trying to hold in the blue-colored loops and coils of his entrails that seemed to come boiling out through his fingers. That is some graphic imagery. Arian dived for the pax to get his own sword, but it was suddenly grabbed roughly from behind. He struggled for an instant, then felt a stunning blow on the back of his head. His eyes filled with a blinding flash of light. This is the one we want, a rough voice rasped as Garion sank into unconsciousness. He was being carried. That much was certain. He could feel the strong arms under him. He didn't know how long it had been since he had been struck on the head. His ears still rang, and he was more than a little sick to his stomach. He stayed limp, but carefully opened one eye. His vision was blurred and uncertain, but he could make out Barak's bearded face looming above him in the darkness. He merged with it, as once before in the snowy woods outside Valorn, he seemed to see the shaggy face of a great bear. closed his eyes, shuddered, and started to struggle weakly. "It's all right, Garion," Rex said, his voice sunk in a kind of despair. "It's me." Garion opened his eyes again, and the bear seemed to be gone. He wasn't even sure if he had ever really seen it. "Are you all right?" Rex asked, setting him on the ground. "He hit me on the head," Garion mumbled, his hand going to the swelling behind his ear. "He won't do it again," Rex muttered, his tone still despairing. Then the huge man sank to the ground and buried his face in his hands. It was dark and difficult to see. But it looked as if Barak's shoulders were shaking, a kind of terrible suppressed grief, a soundless, wrenching series of convulsive sobs. "Where are we?" Arian asked, looking around into the darkness. Barak coughed and wiped at his face. "But a ways from the tents. It took me a little while to catch up to the two who were carrying you off." "What happened?" Arian was still a bit confused. "They're dead. Can you stand up?" "I don't know." Arian tried to get up, but a wave of giddiness swept over him, and his stomach churned. "Never mind. I'll carry you," Rex said in a now grimly practical voice. An owl screeched from a nearby tree, and its ghostly white shape drifted off through the trees ahead of them. As Barak lifted him, Garion closed his eyes and concentrated on keeping his stomach under control. Before long, they came out into the clearing and into its circle of firelight. "Is he all right?" Antipole asked, looking up from bandaging a cut on Dernick's arm. "Up on the head is all," Barak replied, setting Garion down. "Did you run them off?" His voice was harsh, even brutal. "Those that could still run," Silk answered, his voice a bit excited and his ferret eyes bright. "They left a few behind." He pointed at a number of still shapes lying near the edge of the firelight. Eldorn came back into the clearing, looking over his shoulder with his bow half drawn. He was out of breath, his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" he asked, as soon as he saw Garion. Garion nodded, gently fingering the lump behind his ear. "I tried to find the two who took you," the young man declared, "but they were too quick for me. There's some kind of animal out there. I heard it growling while I was looking for you. Awful growls." "The beast is gone now," Barak told him flatly. "What's the matter with you?" Silk asked the big man. "Nothing." "Who were these men?" Arian asked. "Robbers, most likely," Silk surmised, putting away his dagger. "It's one of the benefits of a society that holds men in serfdom. They get bored with being serfs and go out into the forest looking for excitement and profit." "You sound just like Garion," Eldorn objected. "Can't you people understand that serfdom's part of the natural order of things here? Our serfs couldn't take care of themselves alone, so those of us in higher station accept the responsibility of caring for them." "Of course you do," Silk agreed sarcastically. "They're not so well fed as your pigs, nor as well kenneled as your dogs, but you do care for them, don't you?" "That'll do, Silk," Antipole said coolly. "Let's not start bickering among ourselves." She tied a last knot on Dernick's bandage and came over to examine Garion's head. She touched her fingers gently to the lump, and he winced. "It doesn't seem too serious," she observed. "It hurts all the same," he complained. "Of course it does, dear, she said calmly. She dipped a cloth into a pail of cold water and held it to the lump. You're going to have to learn to protect your head, Garion. If you keep banging it like this, you're going to soften your brains. Garion was about to answer that, but Hedar and Mr. Wolf came back into the firelight just then. They're still running, Hedar announced. The steel discs on his horsehide jacket gleamed red in the flickering light. His saber was streaked with blood. He seemed to be awfully good at that part of it, Wolf said. Is everyone all right? A few bumps and bruises is about all, Himbo told them. It could have been much worse. Let's not start worrying about what could have been. Shall we remove those? Iraq growled, pointing at the bodies littering the ground near the brook. Shouldn't they be buried? Vernick asked. His voice shook a little, and his face was very pale. Too much trouble, Drax said bluntly. Your friends can come back later and take care of it, if they feel like it. Isn't that just a little uncivilized? Vernick objected. Drax shrugged. It's customary. Mr. Wolf rolled one of the bodies over and carefully examined the dead man's gray face. Looks like an ordinary horrendous outlaw, he grunted. It's hard to say for sure, though. Eldorn was retrieving his arrows, carefully pulling them out of the bodies. Let's drag them all over their ways, Thorax said to Hedar. I'm getting tired of looking at them. Vernick looked away, and Garion saw two great tears standing in his eyes. Is it hurt, Durnick? He asked sympathetically, sitting on the log beside his friend. I killed one of those men, Garion, the smith replied in a shaking voice. I hit him in the face with my axe. He screamed. His blood splashed all over me. He fell down and kicked on the ground with his heels until he died. You didn't have any choice, Durnick, Garion told him. They were trying to kill us. I've never killed anyone before, Vernick said, tears now running down his face. He kicked the ground for such a long time. Such a terribly long time. Why don't you go to bed, Garion? Antipole suggested firmly. Her eyes were on Durnick's tear-streaked face. Garion understood. Night, Durnick, he said. Got up and started towards one of the tents. He glanced back once. Antipole had seated herself on the log beside the smith and was speaking quietly to him, with one of her arms comfortingly about his shoulders. And that is the end of Chapter 4. I do think, though, that will be where I end it for tonight. It has been an awful lot of fun, but gotta get some rest, you know. And we have made some very, very good progress. So, everyone, I hope you rest easy, have sweet dreams, and a wonderful end to your night, and wake up nice and ready for tomorrow. And for those of you catching this later, I just hope you all have a wonderful rest of your days. Yeah. And thank you all for being here, and for the follows too. I hope you'll join me next time. Try to do an earlier stream tomorrow, just because I will not be here for the rest of the weekend. So everyone, I will see you all later.